Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Autism and Criminal Justice System. My name is Dr. Tyler Whitney, and I'm the co-chair, along with Dr. Nadi Nahoot of the Atlanta Autism Consortium's Board of Directors. The Atlanta Autism Consortium is a nonprofit organization dedicated to creating collaborative conversations throughout the metro Atlanta autism community and beyond. We host free programs just like this one on a wide variety of topics, and are so glad that you've joined us. Before we get started, just a few brief housekeeping notes. Please know that as an attendee, your microphone and camera will remain muted and off, but you can ask questions throughout the program at the chat box in the bottom of your screen. Additionally, we will be emailing out contact information for our panelists to their email address and to the addresses that you use for this program so that you can contact them directly with any other questions you might have. Tonight, we are joined by panelists Michael Gilson, Zachary Tackett, Brian Kelmar, Jude Harrison, and Julia Sivaski. So without further ado, let me start by introducing each panelist. And at that point, once I've read their introduction or their short bio, what I'll do is I will ask them to talk a little bit about a question that we have previously talked about. So Michael Gilson is the co-founder and the vice president of the Autism Innocence Project. His webpage is supportaip.org. The mission of the Autism Innocence Project is to advocate for ADA accommodations, effective education and treatment, and to provide for comprehensive support to defendants with an intellectual disability or developmental disability who are involved within the criminal justice system. The Autism Innocence Project is dedicated to promoting equity, ensuring fair treatment, and safeguarding the rights of individuals with autism. Through advocacy and education efforts, the aim is to address the needs for federal legislation to end mandatory minimums and an expansion of diversion programs for persons with autism or other disabilities. Implementing this goal will require educating legislators, prosecutors, and judges about this population and their need to be understood. So tonight I've asked Michael to lead out for us, talking about his late diagnosis and talking about some of the more known facts and figures related to autism spectrum disorders. Michael?
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Whitney. I am Michael Gilson. I'm one of the co-founders of Autism Innocence Project. I think it's really important to understand autism before discussing our initiatives. And we've been doing a lot of legislative meetings to educate those folks, and they engage much more when they understand what autism has meant in somebody's life. So I was diagnosed only 2 years ago. I had a suspicion about 5 years ago. I was noticing some behaviors in my son and decided it resulted in me taking an online test. I got officially diagnosed 2 years ago. And like any good person with autism, it became a goal of mine to figure out what that meant in my life. And so part of the awakening I've had, and these are, I don't speak for everybody with autism. I know that these are some general commonalities, but because of the social unawareness, like 85% of human communication is nonverbal. And because of my inability to see that or intuit it, I was growing slowly socially. And where that was most obvious in my life was when I was transitioning from elementary to middle school. Ultimately, I can look back and now I see my entire life in a different way. I did experience bullying. I was a pretty good athlete and I was intelligent. So my parents never thought that there was anything wrong. There are few indicators now that they can look back and go, oh man, yeah, that was that. But ultimately, I pursued my diagnosis to help my son. People with supports at a young age tend to have better life outcomes statistically. And, I found that I was wondering, well, am I really suffering from a disability? I've been able to accomplish certain things in my life. I have had struggles. Work, college took me a little longer than most people. And some of these are common because of the anxieties and different aspects. Anxiety is my biggest issue. And I came to find out that 99% of those on the spectrum, that is their number one complaint for different reasons again. But some of the stats that I found interesting, 92% of people on the spectrum do not graduate college. 80% remain unemployed. And keep in mind, this includes what was previously called Asperger's. You'll still hear practitioners use that term. They dropped it because historically it was Hans Asperger that discovered the diagnosis in 1944, and Nazi Germany was not a nice place for a lot of people, but definitely those with autism. So anyhow, some additional stats: 90% do not get married, and 80% will live with a close family member for the majority of their life. I've experienced all of those. College took me nearly 7 years, again, for different reasons, more related to my anxiety and some other things. But, employment's been difficult. I'm not married, although I did father children, and I never did get married, but and I still live with a family member. So it's been an awakening and a process of acceptance in my journey. And I do this advocacy because my son deserves to be understood. And no matter what I do to try and teach him social awareness, he is vulnerable to making mistakes. He's vulnerable to an American criminal justice system which generally does not recognize autism. And I was surprised to find that out. So with that, I'll go ahead and these guys have a wealth of information that they can share way above and beyond what I can share. But we're hoping to be on the move to potentially pass some legislation here in the near future.
Perfect. Thanks, Michael. I'm now going to move to Jude Harrison and read her bio. Jude Harrison is the Director of Communications and co-founder of D3, Decriminalize Developmental Disabilities. Her life before D3 included lighthearted careers such as life coach, yoga teacher, and interior designer. She could have never imagined what 2012 would do to her and her family. When her autistic son was criminalized for behavior that was a direct manifestation of a developmental disability, she found herself in disbelief that the system wouldn't allow autism to be considered before the sentencing phase. Jude chose to use her heartbreak and anger to advocate for change, not only for her son, but for others with developmental disabilities such as autism caught up in the criminal justice system. Little did she know that a blog she wrote and published would catch the eye of Brian Kilmar, a parent going through a similar struggle at the same time. Kilmar contacted Jude, and they have been advocating and fighting for justice together ever since. Now, Jude, welcome. And I just wanted you, if you could, to address, in a general term, what happened to your son, but more so what happened to you and your son and your family and some of those effects that still linger today.
Thank you for having me. So what happened with my son is that he had a consensual relationship with a former girlfriend, and something went very badly with communication. And so, long story short, mostly what he did wrong was communicated poorly via text messaging and that type of thing. So nothing about his case was ever acknowledged or understood within the court system. I know that looking back now, the judge and the prosecutor would have liked to have had laws that allowed them to do that, to understand it fairly. But back then, that just wasn't permitted. So, our family began in 2012, a nightmare that just no good all-American family should have to go through. And, you know, I have two autistic sons. And so the one who got caught up in the system, he has, you know, his life still, it's well, that was 2012 and we're in 2023. So for all this time, you know, his life has been just torn apart, upside down, could not complete college because of the conviction, a felony conviction. He's having an extremely difficult time with getting a job. And so he would very much like to work. He would like to date. That's difficult also. So when you and I talked this afternoon, Tyler, I think you wanted me to focus a little bit on not just the financial devastation, that aspect of loss, because, you know, that was great. We refinanced our home. We went through every bit of our retirement, and then we depended upon family members to help us out financially with what all the costs were. But the losses can't even be counted. You know, the loss of years, the loss of dignity, the loss of self-confidence. My son has absolutely no faith in our system. And I will admit that I have lost faith in our system as well. And, you know, that's why I'm here. That's why I will keep fighting. Just an absolute nightmare that good people should not have to go through. And through my advocacy work, I've learned that we're not alone. Every mom, every dad that we talk with, they go through this same devastation.
And I think, you know, when you talk about these things, Jude, one of the things that becomes really apparent, as you said, is that we're trying to help people understand individual differences, and we're trying to help people understand that the individuals that we love and that we care about are trying to do their very best. You know, I understand, and many times I'm asked the question in my role as an evaluator, you know, well, if this happens, then the floodgates are going to open and everybody's going to say that they have autism. And I'm hoping that as we get more into this, we can have a discussion about the difficulty that comes with an autism diagnosis and how difficult it is to even get an autism diagnosis, because that in and of itself is very, very difficult. But moving forward, thanks very much, Jude. Let's talk to Dr. Zachary Tackett, co-founder and president of the Autism Innocence Project. And he talks about the website again. I'm more familiar with just typing in the word Autism Innocence Project, but Zach, you have supportaip.org as the website. And it says that the mission is to advocate for ADA, effective education and treatments, and provide comprehensive support to defendants. You know, and the same types of reasons that Michael talked about. Zachary, can you talk to us a little bit about your feelings related to intuiting and intuition and the difficulty that high functioning individuals on the autism spectrum have with that?
I think it's, I mean, you know, and like Michael, I was a late diagnosis as well. I was diagnosed in my early 30s. And in my case, you know, it was very shortly after residency that, you know, I started to run into these situations, you know. But basically these rules that you would normally pick up on, or that most people would normally pick up on, I noticed I would frequently miss, you know. I mean, it could, you know, and, you know, it started out, you know, maybe in middle school or high school where, you know, a joke might go over your head or something like that. And it's, you know, it's not really an intelligence issue. It's just a matter of being able to put two and two together. I liken it to running on a Mac operating system as opposed to a PC.
Absolutely. Can you talk to us a little bit, Zach, about brain structures and functions and the different areas in the brain where autism seems to affect people in terms of the topology and brain structures and the functions related?
Yes. So there on the outermost part of the brain, there's the cerebral cortex. And this part of the brain is responsible for movement, sensation, planning, and social behaviors. And it tends to show a very different pattern of thickness in patients with autism. Additionally, studies in the brain tissue of the cerebellum, which is most commonly known for its role in coordination of skeletal muscle movement, has more recently been found to play a role in cognition and social interaction. And there are differences in tissue densities in the parts of the cerebellum that undertake these functions in autistic folks as compared to matched neurotypical counterparts. And this is per a meta-analysis of 17 different imaging studies. And, also the amygdala shows a wide variety of structural differences. So the amygdala is the brain's danger detector. It's, you might know of it as the fight or flight center. And this, as I say, it has quite a variation on size. When you're very young as an autistic person, it tends to be larger than normal. However, it shrinks to the point that when an autistic person is an adult, it's actually smaller than normal. And these are just a few of the more common ones that we see, but there are quite a few of them.
Perfect. Can you give us some like real life examples? I know you talked about missing jokes or not understanding some of the social interactions. Are there other scenarios that you can think of where this brain behavior relationship is readily apparent to most people? And I guess for people that are not on the autism spectrum, they may not even realize it.
Yeah, I mean, it's very common. And, the part where it becomes a real issue here are when mistakes lead to basically a criminal consequence. So, we often have the scenario where there's actually someone who is told by a family friend, hey, can you take this package to my associate's house, just across the river? And they don't pick up on, for instance, the fact that, there's something odd about this favor they're asking,
Sure.
And when they arrive at this house, they're not greeted by their family friend's associate. Rather, they're greeted by the United States Drug Enforcement Administration, which, they did not intuit that the package probably contained cocaine. So, with that being said, I mean, going across state lines, they're not going to be charged with possession or even dealing. They're going to be charged with something more along the lines of trafficking, which, as our attorney experts here could probably attest, there's probably some mandatory minimums involved there.
Sure, absolutely. Zach, thanks so much. Next, let's move to Brian Kelmar, the executive director and co-founder of LRIDD. It's a nonprofit legal reform for the intellectually and developmentally disabled. He's a proud father of an autistic son and his two other sons. He's been a senior executive of large corporations as well as an entrepreneur. He is a retired Navy commander and naval aviator with over 500 career landings. As a Department of Defense Military Research Fellow, he co-authored a book on a model for leading change. He was recognized for his advocacy work with the Arc of Virginia for Catalyst for the Change Award. He has an undergraduate degree from Penn State, an MBA from Troy State University, and doctoral studies at Nova Southeastern University in Florida, and an executive education from Harvard Business School. He is also an avid marathon and ultra marathon runner in his spare time. Brian, welcome. And if you could talk some on your lobbying advocacy and the Virginia legislation that you helped to get passed.
Thank you, Tyler. My background, as Tyler mentioned, is I'm a father of an autistic child who got caught up in the criminal justice system. And what happened at the sentencing, the judge said clearly my son had a disability, but unfortunately the state of Virginia, the Commonwealth of Virginia, did not recognize autism and developmental disabilities. And I just couldn't believe it. I was shocked. So I started reaching out to my local legislators and I started telling them my story along with Jude. and several of the other parents, and we met with them, and we wanted to do a couple different things. One, we wanted to prevent people getting caught up in the criminal justice system. And the first thing we said is people with autism and developmental disabilities need to be taught appropriate behaviors. So we introduced a law that we actually wrote to say, as part of an individual's education plan, a person must get appropriate behavior training and appropriate interaction training from grades K through 12. And that law passed unanimously. We also have a bill that said if they do get caught up in the criminal justice system, we want them to have a chance for diversion. So during the sentencing phase, we codified what was already known they could do, that judges could do, but now we codified it to make it law to say judges can actually do a diversion program for those with autism caught up in the criminal justice system. That also passed unanimously. And then we also recently passed one which was, hey, what happens to people in the middle? So we passed a law that said if they have autism and you can show that they do, that needs to be taken into account from the very beginning of the criminal justice system, not just towards the end. And that passed here, I think it was last summer, and that became law. And we're trying to roll out these bills across the United States in different states where we're reaching out to, and we're working with Zach and Michael on trying to accomplish similar legislation in the national level.
Brian, can I ask you, in terms of your interface with, attorneys, prosecutors, people that are trying to pass laws, what is the reception usually, when you go to them?
So as I mentioned, we had overwhelming support in the legislation, and I think it's an education process. Most of the legislators, when we first went there, Jude and I would go there and we talk about autism and we'd get these strange looks. And after about the third year of us going there, we started hearing them talk about autism in conference committees that we said, what, did they just say autism? And they've started to pick that up. So it's an education process. And once they learn and understand, we've had pretty much unanimous bipartisan support of both sides, realizing it's not a political issue, it's an autism issue. And 1 in 36 people have autism. And it doesn't matter what religion, color, party, or whatever it may be, it doesn't discriminate. So it's a major issue. And I think people start to understand that once we educate them on understanding what that means to have autism.
I think it's super, and I think it's very important, because as this world continues to turn, we see a lot of need for understanding and tolerance and working together. And I think autism is a place where a lot of us, find a cause. So I really appreciate everything that you're doing, Brian. Let's move and let's talk to Robert Hale, who's a criminal defense attorney in Raleigh, North Carolina in private practice. He attended UNC Chapel Hill, receiving a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science, and thereafter attended UNC Law School and graduated in 1991. From 1986 until 1990, and the law school from 91 to 94. His legal career began with an internship in the Office of the Federal Public Defender, EDNC. He was hired to be the first research and writing specialist for the office in 95 and continued in that role for a couple of years until 97. He was next promoted to Assistant Federal Public Defender and served in that capacity until 1999. As the Assistant Federal Public Defender, he represented many indigent defendants charged with federal crimes at both trials and appellate levels. Mr. Hale left the Federal Defender's Office in 1999 and entered private practice. He continued to represent indigent defendants in both state and federal courts, including numerous post-conviction death penalty cases and other trial and appellate matters in both state and federal courts. Mr. Hale's experience representing criminal defendants who suffer from autism or ASD began approximately 10 years ago when he represented a client charged with manufacture of child pornography. federal court. Since then, he's represented numerous other clients with ASD who were charged with child pornography offenses. He's utilized some of the best experts in the field, including Dr. Gary Mezevov and Dr. Holmes, in representing his clients. Mr. Hale, welcome. And if you wouldn't mind, I'd love to hear a little bit more about your work in the courts and, your broad array of experiences defending individuals with autism in the court system.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm happy to be here and honored to be here because it's a hugely important topic, and it's not one that is that easy to defend for a variety of reasons, or at least to navigate in the criminal justice system, which a lot of the other panel members have already mentioned. First of all, as we know, there's this big learning curve. And for me, my experience was that I first represented someone on post-conviction in a federal case, and the lawyers that first the case began as a state case and then turned into a federal case, and the lawyers that had the case, even at the federal level, they had information that the person had autism, and they did a background, sort of a cursory background investigation, and they knew that he had ADHD, but he really hadn't been, I don't know, maybe as recently diagnosed with autism, but they didn't really appreciate what that meant. So my beginning of understanding about this situation was in that case where those lawyers had some idea of autism, but they didn't understand it, and they sent him off for an evaluation for competency. And so he was gone so they knew about ADHD. They might have heard like a little tale of autism, but didn't really appreciate it. By the way, one of the two lawyers on that case had two children who were very severely autistic. So they couldn't really, I think that guy was really taking the lead role in the case. And I think he compared my client to his son and daughter, and they were so far on the autistic side of the spectrum that he didn't fully appreciate it as it regarded the person the client that I eventually ended up representing, because the spectrum is so large. And this person was a college graduate, and so many times people think that highly functioning people, well, there can't be anything wrong with them, like what's wrong with them? And then so I want to go back to that whenever the time comes, but then later on so that was 10 years ago, and what my learning experience was it benefited incredibly by the family members of this person. So basically what happened was, so this person, this client, he was charged with producing child pornography. Now, he was a photographer, yet he really didn't have like a full-time steady job. He came from a wealthy family, and his parents helped him through college, his mom in particular. So he got through college. He's a college graduate, but he really never did live on his own too well. And then he used to go around taking pictures and filming sporting events and stuff. And he ended up meeting someone who maybe thought he was a meal ticket or something or whatever. They had a romantic relationship. And then it came to pass that she thought he didn't want to be with her or whatever. And she wanted to use her daughter as a ploy, if you will, to bring him back, to keep her with him. So the daughter was about 15 or 16 at the time. And so, this is not pleasant to talk about, but she started having sex with her daughter and sending him videos of that. Well, he didn't. So this is a vignette here, and I don't want to go on too long, but it's illustrative for a whole lot of different reasons. But he, though, when he received these videos, he didn't ever, first of all, he didn't ask for the videos. He did, but along the way, he got the idea that if they continued to send him these videos, that they would be getting themselves into trouble. He wanted to distance himself from them. Now, mind you, he was a photographer, never took a picture, never did anything like that. But he got in his mind that the more they sent him these videos, the better his position would be to stay, to keep them away from him. And so at a certain point, he said, well, no, you should act like you're into it more, or something like that. But this is well, not the crazy thing, but the thing was, he really was thinking that this was something that he could use to keep them away from him. And so, but it's almost impossible to explain that. But so I went to see him. So he was charged in state court with exploitation of a minor, North Carolina. Then the case went to federal court. He paid his first lawyer $50,000, his federal lawyers $100,000. They sent him for a competency evaluation. He was gone for 6 months, and this is something you never do. I mean, if you can afford it, you pay for it yourself. He was gone for 6 months to federal prison to get a competency evaluation. Of course, they said he was competent. After all, he was a college graduate, and he was smart enough to know who the judge is and what the judge's job is, who the prosecutor is, what the prosecutor's job is, and what the defense lawyer's job is. But by the time he came back, the script had been flipped on him by the very capable lawyer for the mother. And the way the whole thing was sewn up was that, but for him, none of this would have ever happened. Meanwhile, he thought he was outsmarting everyone else. So when I went to go see him the first time, I got a hugely important thing, which is that, and I'm friends with this person's family, and his sister, she gave me a lot of really good advice. I'm in Raleigh, North Carolina. He was in FCI Williamsburg in South Carolina. And she said, look, when you go down there, and he's pretty far on the spectrum to the autism side. And I went down there, she said, look, here's a couple tips. When you go down there, don't put your chair facing right to him, like angle it to the side a little bit. Don't talk too much. Let him talk to you, and thereby build a bit of a rapport. And so I did that, and I met him, and we talked about our mutual, his cousin, my really good friend. And so I got to know him and got to build a rapport with him. And what was really clear after reviewing everything in the case is that his lawyers, his $100,000 lawyers, didn't really ever understand what autism was about. And there were 2 sentencing hearings, and the younger one with the 2 autistic children didn't argue the case. It was the older one, and he's a super nice guy, very, very accomplished attorney. But he tried to explain it to the judge by saying, yes, it's a lack of ability to understand social cues, which is all he ever gleaned from his whatever anybody ever told him. They had an expert who came up with an autism evaluation, but even that expert wasn't he would self-describe not really proficient in autism. He said, I barely got this diagnosis. And he used to work for the Bureau of Prisons. I've known him for 25 years. He didn't even really nail it. And so what happened was, in that first case, basically, there was not a convincing defense presented that, and who could, and I mean, and so what I was trying to do was to argue that those lawyers were ineffective, and tried my best, was not successful. He got 22 years in prison for manufacturing child pornography, when it was really the mother taking pictures of her having sex with her own daughter, sending it to him. So that was my beginning. And we didn't even get a hearing, and he still sits with 22 years in federal prison. Since then, I've had a whole bunch of other people who have been charged with, who were autistic or on the spectrum, who've been charged with mostly child pornography. Now, the first person, calling the photographer, he never asked for any pictures to be taken. He never distributed any pictures. And so, you know, what's the thing that was the most surprising to me was he wasn't even into that, but it came to him, but in his own mind, he thought he was going to get ahead of everybody by letting them continue to do it. And so the next time I went down to talk to him, I was like, but why did you encourage them to send pictures? And he was like, well, it's about like Donald Duck when his kids stole his cigars. And I said, what? He's like, yeah. He said, well, you know, his kids stole his cigars, and so he made them smoke them till they turned green. And I was like, well, what do you mean? And he said, well, anybody ought to know that if they encourage somebody to do something that they know they shouldn't do, that they ought not to do it. And so I thought about that. I'm like, so you mean like so you're saying like if I said to you, oh, okay, if you want to be my friend, walk 100 feet on hot coals, that you ought not to want to be my friend because I'm not a good friend to you. He's like, exactly. And then his sister had sent me a picture of a bumper sticker that said, as if it was like an ambulance in your rear view, it says autism, seeing things differently, like backwards. So but because of, and in that case, importantly, the first 3 lawyers never really spoke to his family, and never really, I mean, they got paid big fees, maybe they went golfing, I don't know, but they never really spoke to the family, so they never really came to understand him. And that's why they and then they sent him on for this competency evaluation for 6 months. And when he came back, all of a sudden, so that explanation, what I just gave, what he told me, and what is absolutely true, the court could not believe. The court believed, but for him, this never would have happened. And yet the opposite is actually true. It was just that the mother was doing it. So then, since then, and not to go on and on forever, but since then, I've had a bunch of other cases where the same thing pops up, and you see, and it's mostly, I mean, in my experience, is all child pornography. And it's people who, and the common themes, cookie cutter, if you will, are people who don't have much of a social situation, mostly live home with their parents, don't really have, I mean, even college graduates or not, but still never really lived well too, you know, much on their own, but still have good Lord, sorry, inability to have the normal type of social relationships that one would expect for a person their age. And then they fall into this trap, and the trap is a big trap. So most of my experiences with autistic people and child pornography, but just so that for everyone to know how prevalent it is. Of all, like 5 of my last 4, what I would call big cases like this, have been people with autism or autism spectrum disorder, and the 5th was close. You know, had some characteristics that were, whether antisocial or whatever. But you know, the reason I think I have something to add to this conversation, and I'm happy to add to it, is to just to say a few of those things, including it's difficult to educate judges, and it's difficult to educate prosecutors about it. When I talk to a prosecutor, and back to the pilot's point, it had, to the extent it could be done to begin with, is also much better. My ability to fix the photographer's case after he'd already been convicted and gotten 22 years was hugely less than it would have been to begin with. Because when it's most important, you know, any criminal case, there's a guilt part and then there's the sentencing part. And the prosecutor largely has to controls what any kind of a plea would be. And so if the prosecutor isn't made to understand how this case is different, then the sentencing part, I mean, the sentencing part might not even matter that much. So it's crucial to get in early to educate the prosecutor. Of course, you need a diagnosis and experts here and experts there. But that part is so significant. If I've come behind other people in federal court and in state court also, where they fired their lawyers and they hired me, because now people think I know what I'm talking about in this field to some degree. But it's imperative to get there early and to understand that this is not like depression. It's not like drug use. And it has an incredible mitigating value that really gets back before the guilt part, because so many people don't recognize that in many ways it takes away from the guilt. It's not as much of a sentencing factor as a trap for the unwary in some circumstances. And that's what child pornography is for people who aren't all that social. Maybe they're virgins, maybe they live at home with their parents. And then of course, you know, we all know, like, they tend to maybe gravitate towards younger people because they're less threatening and so on. So that might have been a long-winded way to go into it, but there's a whole bunch of other examples that I have of people who've fallen into the same basic situation.
Robert, thank you so much. Amazing work that you're doing. Let's get to Julia Sailovsky. She's a legal consultant with the Autism Innocence Project. She's autistic, she's non-binary, and artist practicing within the legal field. Julia uses collaborative approaches to the law by emphasizing the expert as the user to facilitate social practice projects. Holding a Bachelor's of Fine Arts in Sculpture from Virginia Commonwealth and a Master's of Fine Arts in Curatorial Practice from MICA. Currently, they are pursuing a Juris Doctorate to be able to practice law as an artist. The activism centers on issues of disability, trans right, and education law. If you could talk to us about your autism, being a law student and being non-binary, that would be phenomenal.
Yeah, and I want to start that off by saying that thank you for working on the pronouns, because I think that's important to notice, is that it is about practice and it is about making the mistake. So thank you. Yeah, so I am here to talk about, the first thing I wanted to do is I was actually sitting here and Robert was talking and I thought about something. I thought about when I was diagnosed, which was last August. I entered law school. I looked around and there was no color. The rules were different and people were being mean to me in a way that put me back to high school. I've always known, or I thought prior to my diagnosis, that I was the problem, that something was wrong with me. autistic people, we tie rules to morality. So when I approach someone and I don't shake their hand correctly and it's not professional, and I see that slight wince in their eye, it feels like I have hurt them, I have harmed them. And that's a really important to understand when you think about the autistic defendant. And so I decided to pull up this piece of writing I wrote last year, right when I got diagnosed, because I had suffered from autistic burnout during law school, which is not uncommon. There's actually a statistic that the more education an autistic person receives, the less likely they will to have a job and the more likely they will to receive autistic burnout, which means that every time I get one more degree, I'm actually setting myself up for failure. And so I wrote, every time I say I'm autistic, it feels like I'm telling someone I deserve to be who I am and that my existence is worth it. It feels like relief. It feels like when you climbed a mountain and took the breath of fresh air, the moment you sit down and brew the tea before the sunrise. Saying it out loud is a constant reminder that I deserve to be who I was this whole time. It explains relationships with my family. It explains why my parents were confused. It explains how I think, move, act, look. It tells me that I am me and it's okay. When you get to finally know that you are not a broken horse, that you might just be a zebra, you suddenly know that it's not that you weren't meant to move through the wind. It's just that they run and you might skip. We all have the same wind touching our backs. And I just pulled that up and just ignored my notes for a second because I wanted to bring up that important facet about being autistic. It's not just the autistic defendant, it's the fact that my entire experience in my body means that I had to learn the rules of social cues to survive, to not offend someone. Autistic people are 9 times more likely to commit or try to commit suicide. And that's because we spend all of this time thinking. So imagine that you're an autistic defendant and you do not have proper notice of the law because the law is written with certain social rules that you cannot properly interpret. It is arguably a legality issue in our legal system. Imagine you're an autistic person who makes one of these mistakes, and because you're so rule bound and these rules are bound with morality, you already believe that you deserve the worst criminal punishment. And then you get it, even though you really didn't deserve it. The reality is someone even as educated as I am is likely to sit in front of a police officer, and I cannot even equally participate as a witness to a crime. Because if the officer decides to lie to me, I won't be able to tell. They could sit there and tell me that I did something, and I could know by fact I did not. But because I'm autistic, I will trust that they are telling me the truth and that maybe I made the mistake. And you guys just heard how educated I was. I am literally on my 3rd degree, but I am terrified every day that I could be one of those people because I know it's happened. And I know that it happens in classroom settings. I have a disciplinary record from when I was younger. I have an arrest record, actually. I did have a charge. It is not something related to my autism, but I could look back and imagine how the circumstances I got into was actually because officers were lying to me and I got confused about where to walk. And so that's why this law is important. Right now, there's an unequal application of the law across the country for autistic defendants. And I wasn't sure if you wanted me to talk more about that, but yeah, let me know.
You to, and the reason that I want you to is because just as you're expressing, you know, as Robert said, the perception is different, you know, for a person with autism. So, you know, the eye studies that were done in the early 2000s by Ami Klin and Warren Jones showed that as kids were looking at very classic movies, their eyes were not tracking the things that people that were not autistic were tracking. And so if you say to someone, well, you know, you are subject to these rules, and because you said it in English and at a tone where a person should be able to hear it, you just assume understanding. That is the first place. You know, one of the guys that helped write the DSM-4 and 5, you know, Fred Volkmar from Yale said, if you've seen one person with autism, you've seen one person with autism. The entire spectrum is so broad and so diverse that when I go in and I'm part of a legal team and I'm talking to a prosecutor pre-trial, my first statement is, let me tell you about this person's autism. So
Exactly.
that I'm only talking about the individual that we're having a discussion about.
Exactly. And that's exactly what I get at with this legislation, is the fact that what we're advocating for, it's not really reform. It's advocating to recognize my existence, and that my existence is different. I know we used the word high functioning before. So autistic people were trying to get away from that, but that's a really easy term to understand. So we like to say different functioning, because the reality is, although I can talk really well, I can blend into this panelist environment. Many autistic people can't, but we do have core similarities where we both get drained from interactions like these. I can feel the energy pooling from my body right now. And so I like to tell this story about rules when it comes to thinking about advocacy, diversion, and equal application of the law, accommodations for autistic people in the criminal justice system. Not specifically accommodations just for them to be in the jail, just for us to be in sentencing. I'm talking accommodations for us to also participate in our civic duty in the criminal justice system. I have every right to be a valuable witness, as I have every right to a fair trial as an autistic defendant. And so I like to tell this story about the rule of this 4-year-old I lived with, who is just amazing. And we have a really low recidivism in autism because we're rule-based. And the reality was that even though I was diagnosed with autism, this 4-year-old is also autistic. I learned that even I need to work on my communication with other autistics, because one day he kept touching the stove and I was terrified. And at first I kept saying, don't touch the stove. Like, no. And then he kept doing it. Now this kid listens. So I was like, okay, hold on, Julia. You just learned about autism, and you just learned about how all you wanted your whole life was that other people would be a partner, be a collaborator in the communication process with you, that you weren't the only one doing all the work. And so I was like, okay, don't touch the stove because I am worried about your safety. It is really hot and you could burn yourself. Immediately, he stopped touching the stove and he never touched it again. That is a great example of the difference between working together and recognizing autism versus ignoring it.
Right.
Yeah,
One thing
go for it.
that I wanted to counter that with, I was in federal court and a judge was telling me about how long he had been a federal judge. And he told me how old he was. He said he was over 80. And he said, I can tell you what I know about autism. He said, there are two types of autism: the type where the individual cannot communicate well and they use other methods to communicate. And then he pointed to a gentleman in the courtroom that was well dressed. He said, you see that young man over there? And I said, yes. He said, that is my law clerk, and he has autism as well. And that's the type of autism we're talking about. And I'm like, wait a minute, I've been doing this for almost 20 years. There's way more than two types of autism, but I mean, it's those types of myths and urban legends that we're trying to overcome.
And the worst part is I can be that person in the perfect suit, but because of autistic burnout, because of my 25 years of continuing to follow these rules, I actually regressed last year. I had to relearn with my professor. I was very fortunate to have, I'm going to just shout him out, Professor Meyerson at the University of Baltimore. He was with me when I got my diagnosis, and he helped me because I started experiencing for the first time in my life an inability to write professional emails. I accidentally said things that were like right off the top of my mouth, like, and in the law setting, an extremely professional setting, this could have cost me like a lot of opportunities. So Professor Meyerson had to like help me because I regressed so far back, things that I learned. And it's like, I could be that person sitting in that chair, but I also could any day, from lack of having that collaboration, turn into the person that is tired of speaking.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for that. It's been amazing. Well, our panel, as you can tell, is incredibly qualified, not only by their professional roles, but also by their experiences in life with individuals with autism. And I think if we sat here all night, we couldn't get through all the stories that we've had, because I can tell you that to this day, I'm not very mechanically inclined, and I will from time to time, when someone comes in my office and I see a lot of individuals with autism, ask them if they can fix something for me in my office, because I certainly can't fix it and they usually can. So, that's one thing that I've found. Individuals with autism are very inclined a lot of times to be much more mechanically inclined than I am. So with our last 15 minutes or so, I'd just like to open up the discussion to our great participants that have not been able to speak. So if you have a question for the panel, if you'd just like to type it into the chat, and I will go back through chats and look at some of what's been said. And I'd love to get these panelists to respond to any questions that you have. If there are any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat.
Dr. Whitney, can I chime in real quickly while you're waiting for the first question? There's
Sure.
something that I like to share, and I'm sure you're aware this, the double empathy problem. A study, I believe it was done in Australia, and the reason it's so important to me when I'm doing the advocacy to try and share that story is because what happened is they put those with autism in a circle and played the game telephone. And then they did the same thing with neurotypicals, and they measured the results. Both groups did fine. It wasn't until they mixed them together that the results went down drastically. And so, not being a professional, what they suggested that meant was, the 1 in 36, I always joke with Zach, I said, we have to start an autism city, because I don't think I'd be disabled in that city nearly as much as I am in the world as I live in it today. And so I just think that's an important point to make. The communication seems to be stronger when I'm talking to other folks around the spectrum.
Perfect. First question, and this is for anyone on the panel, is how are the laws in Georgia regarding the criminal justice system? Does anybody want to take that, or would you like me to take that? Because Georgia is where I live. I can tell you that the laws are different every jurisdiction that I'm involved in. It doesn't matter whether it's a superior court case, whether it is a divorce case, whether it is a federal case. The only difference with the federal programming is that there are things like mandatory minimums and those types of things. And so when you talk about the laws, what you're talking about is, and this is where people like Robert and other people around the country that I've had the opportunity to work with become very, very important. You need local professionals that understand the layout of the court system that you're dealing with, the nature of the judge, who the prosecutor is, all of the people involved in the case. Because as Robert said, getting to the individuals that are going to be making decisions early and helping them understand the individual differences related to an autism spectrum disorder are key. So I would say that, just to give some background, the United States is about a decade behind, I believe, from a legal standpoint in terms of advocacy for individuals on the autism spectrum disorder. When you look at some of the cases that have been international, there was a gentleman that was a computer person in the United Kingdom that was accused of hacking into some of our government databases, and the United Kingdom refused to extradite him because they felt it would be cruel and unusual punishment. That's the kind of thing that we're talking about. We oftentimes see individuals questioned by police officers, law enforcement, federal FBI agents, and otherwise using what's called the Reed method, which is a method that they're taught in interviewing that is meant to evoke a confession. And individuals that don't understand communication well and language well understand that it's very difficult even when you're evenly matched. But when you have people that are trying to get you to say or do things that are going to implicate you in a criminal situation, that's very, very difficult. So first and foremost, I would say that we have a long way to go in every state, including the state of Georgia. But this doesn't I know we're not talking about schools and other systems, but this also applies to schools as it would be universities, K through 12, those types of things, because the misunderstanding isn't something that is unique just to the criminal justice system. It happens proverbially in almost any system that humans interact with, including here in the state of Georgia. One of the next question that we have is my son just turned 18. I'm his guardian and conservator. He also has a moderate to severe intellectual disability and anxiety. I submit a photo of my son with the police because manipulation is easy. How else can I protect my son going forward? Anybody like to answer that?
I
Yeah.
would just say part of it is ongoing communication with your son is key. So this way, you talk through things, particularly things that he may not understand. And you really have to be a little bit ahead of the game in order to anticipate things that may come up. Anyone else want to chime in and kind of, I would say that, early talks about, different topics that tend to be recurring themes with autistic defendants. So I would say, things like, appropriate social behavior, appropriate sexual behavior, things like that.
I would say, I think Brian is actually going to have a lot of advice, Brian or Jude, on this topic. But for specifically, I know your son is intellectually disabled, but for autistic defendants or children, I know that someone else asked here about the blocking websites. Protection for autistic people is not about blocking. It is about autonomy and education. Autistic people they're very different disabilities, intellectual disability versus autism. And so it is important to practice autonomous education for sex ed, making sure that we understand, because a great example is that you do have autistic people that misunderstand these issues, but I'm also an autistic person that's been sexually assaulted 3 times. And that has to do a lot with misunderstanding social cues, because no one did talk to me about my autonomy. And so I think that's really important to clarify. Bellesa, Bellesa, has helpful resources on that. But I think Jude and Brian will be able to address the intellectual disability better.
So
Okay,
thanks, Brian. One thing that I'll just say very quickly, we have a few connections. If you go to d3.org, we can help you find someone who can offer even online classes. There are, I know Dr. Michelle Garcia down in Texas has one. We have a couple of people here in Virginia who have classes, and they walk you through appropriate sexuality, for lack of a better word, so that you don't become a victim of somebody else's problem. So, Brian, did you want to take it over from there?
Sure. So a couple points here. First of all, I want to tell people, if you have an autistic child or a person with intellectual and developmental disabilities, no matter what they think, never, ever let them talk to someone from the law. Because, you've heard a couple stories here. They're easily manipulated. They could be lied to and they won't pick it up. They're pleasing, and they'll want to, if you say, did you kill President Kennedy? And they'll go, yes, I did. And it's like, well, you weren't even born then. So that's one thing I say important, because they can easily incriminate themselves and get in trouble. That's number one. Number two, there is, as we passed here in Virginia, it is required as part of the IEP, the Individual Education Plan, that they have appropriate sexual health education that is in regards to their developmental disability. For example, if they're 15, but their disability, they're really like a 10-year-old, they're supposed to teach them at the appropriate age level. As Jude said, we have some connections at some of the people that offer these courses that are online. And I recommend that everyone take a course, whether it's one of the ones that we have or find some other ones that are geared specifically towards people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, because it's explained on their level and how appropriate, what's wrong and what's right. And we found that everyone that has come out of it, as I think as Julia mentioned, is that they're very rule bound. They will follow those rules to the nth degree.
Right. I also recommend to the people that come and see me that you create a small card, like a medic alert bracelet that you can laminate and put in their wallet or their purse. And if there's any type of interaction with law enforcement, that they hand it to law enforcement that says, my name is so-and-so, I have a developmental disability, or I have autism. Could you please call? And then, get them their advocate or their person to be with them when they're interacting with law enforcement. I think
There's actually case law that specifically states that police officers must adjust their interrogation techniques for intellectually disabled people. So if you have an intellectually disabled child, it is helpful to put a card that's, especially if they choose not to use verbal language as their communication method, and autistic children, make sure there's a card that says that they need an accommodation to have effective communication. And like, that's part, the read technique issue is also a constitutional issue, but the courts have ruled on this. It is an issue.
Right. One of the other things I wanted to point out, former past president of the AAC, Salim Sanier, is pointing out, it's helpful to have a psychologist to help educate about autism. But, what I've heard here amongst this group of adults, both parents of autistic individuals and autistic adult self-advocates, a lot of the people on the high functioning end, and I'm not going to go into the whole misnomer of high functioning autism, but what I'm going to say is a lot of individuals with autism can advocate for themselves and can talk about the way that they feel, but they need to be given an opportunity to be safe and comfortable and with someone that they're comfortable with before, they feel okay to talk about that. So it's very important, for the education to be synonymous with the situation and what's going on. But a lot of the high functioning individuals do know their likes and dislikes and those kind of things. And if you can help to if you can de-escalate it and make it a little bit more comfortable, obviously that can be very helpful for them as well. Right? Okay.
Can I add one thing? Am I on
Yes,
here?
please.
Well,
Yeah.
I will say this, and I don't know if it's just a prophylactic thing to say to everyone, but given the incredibly harsh sentences that can come from child pornography, I mean, if you have an autistic child or person connected to you, I mean, it's important that they be made fully aware, because rule followers that they need to know, you can't look at these kind of pictures. And the saddest thing is, these things are out there on the tray for anybody to look at. And the same pictures are out there all the time. I mean, I represent people, and the same pictures are out there all the time. And like I said, 4 out of the 5 of my last cases, and I call these big cases because they are big cases, because they're really serious. Even the United States government hosts websites that put these pictures out, and the victims of child pornography have lawyers who get paid when somebody gets prosecuted for downloading the picture, which is crazy. And so I will say, I mean, not to say for every single, I mean, it's almost impossible to say you could teach somebody about every different kind of crime, but for sure, when it comes to the internet, pornography, sexual exploration, not exploitation, I think it's worthwhile to have a conversation to say, hey, look, let's just be aware. And there are programs that you can do like Net Nanny and stuff, but I think if there's any kind of concern, that's really important, because falling into this trap of the people I represent is a complete and total disaster. So that's just my 2 cents there.
And the reality is, when autistic people know about it, like Robert said, just be honest. It's better to tell your child straight up the reality than it is to let them accidentally not understand something a neurotypical does or something they see.
I just want to say real quickly that I believe no matter how much you teach them, obviously the rules are great, but we've run into cases where the rule said one thing, and the person thought they were following that rule, and somehow still ended up in a situation that can result in, as Robert said, these tremendous consequences. There's a 15-year-old, he photoshopped something, and it was a classmate, an underage girl. He blurred out her chest after photoshopping. He could be looking at a decade or more in prison. And that just blew my mind when I heard that. It was easily manipulation from his classmates, and he just wanted to fit in, and here he is. So anyway, just wanted to say that the rule thing is,
if you remember, and Julia, if you remember about that case, he had kids that were photographing him on the bus when they dare him to do something and putting it on the internet. He was copying behavior of people, trying to normalize himself doing the behavior.
Well, and the worst part about it is, if a rule is what it is, we are going to follow it because we are going to try to be good people morally. So if it says the rule is don't post naked photos, and we know that's a bad thing, we might Photoshop it so that we still, because there's there's conflicting rules. If I don't do this, these people will hate me and I won't have friends, and I'm going to hurt their feelings. If I do it, I'm going to break the law and hurt someone else. So I'm going to make a fake one so I do not hurt anyone. Now, and like, that's how we think. I mean, that's why I can understand this kid and exactly how he thought, because it makes sense to me.
Yeah. Well, I just want to take the time right now. I know we're a little bit past our time, and I know we started late, and I could go on forever because this is what I do. This is what I love. But I am so grateful to the expertise of this panel and to all the people that have been involved. I'm sorry that we didn't get into a lot of the other aspects or issues, but we will be better prepared technically in the future. I will be better prepared because that was my responsibility. I apologize. And let's do it again sometime, because this is really helpful. It's really good. And you get to hear a lot about life in the world of individuals with autism spectrum disorders trying to be and to live in a world where people are different than they are. Thanks very much, everybody, and have a great evening.
Can I put one plug in real quick?
Sure, absolutely.
So we talked, we have over 450 parents that have these similar situations. And if you do find yourself getting in that situation, reach out to us on the webpage, D3, Decriminalize Developmental Disabilities. And we actually talk to you one-on-one and help parents find the resources and get to us early.
and if you're autistic, D3 is THREE, not the number 3, correct, Brian?
Right. I put them in the chat earlier on because one of the folks that was listening said, could you list those? So I did list D3 LRIDD. So I want to make sure that everybody knows. And like I said, we'll be sending out the contacts to all of our great panelists, and you can contact them directly. Thank you so much for everybody for attending, and thank everybody for their time and their effort. This is a very, very valuable cause. Have a great evening.